don't know if it could be called a party if you weren't here, Molly. Your energy is fantastic. So it's Molly and I co-chair the programming committee and for LEAP Indiana. And our first speaker for our fourth Monday coffee hour is Michelle Clemens. She's psychology faculty at IUPUI. And we also get to have her teach for us at Ivy Tech as well. And she's going to talk to us today about using Google applications in virtual learning. So Michelle, I will go ahead and turn it over to you.
All right, thank you, Rachel. So my name is Michelle Clemens. I teach business communications and team dynamics and leadership courses at IUPUI within the Kelley School of Business. And what we're going to look at today is how to use Google applications to improve the virtual learning experience. I'm going to share several slides showing you examples of what I've done in the classroom over the past several months. And then I'll open it up at the end for you to ask questions, for me to help you brainstorm ideas of things that may work for you and may help you to build a better environment within your classroom when it comes to specifically using breakout rooms. A lot of times we send students into breakout rooms and we hope that they'll do what we told them to do. But one of the things that I found out about via student feedback and having some discussions with students during the fall term is that a lot of times they would get in there, they wouldn't necessarily know what they needed to do. They didn't remember all the directions. Very similar to a in-person classroom where students will be in groups and they'll raise their hands and ask questions. If we don't give enough guidance and don't give clear enough guidance when students go into breakout rooms, they're a little bit lost. And sometimes they're afraid to come back to the main room to ask those questions and gain that clarity. And so one of the things that I've used a lot over the past year is Google Forms, Google Docs, and various other Google applications to help give students a purpose when they're in those breakout rooms so that they can still have that opportunity to talk to peers and work through problems, but also have the guidance necessary to stay on track in that process. So what I'm going to do today is talk about virtual learning goals. I'll share an example of sign-in sheets that I use and some tips related to that. I'll talk about think, pair, share and ways to utilize Google Forms to do that in a different manner. You may be using the chat box for that right now, but this gives people a little bit more time to think about things. I'll share some breakout room activities that I've completed during the year that have been fairly simple to put together, but have given students more of a purpose and goal when they're in their breakout room sessions. I'll provide tips and tricks for what you can do to build success within this process, and then I'll leave room at the end for questions, as well as to help you figure out how to maybe do some of these things within your classroom environment. So for me personally, when it comes to virtual learning goals, it's threefold for me. I want to, of course, teach the course objectives, right? All of us, that's one of our main goals, to ensure that students leave the course with the material, knowledge, understanding, and ideas that are necessary for them to be successful. But I also want to provide structure for students, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. There has been just a lack of structure in general in life. People feel like they can't predict things in the way that they used to be able to predict them. And especially with working with students that are already adjusting to a new structure, they're adjusting to virtual learning, they're adjusting to college, they're adjusting to all these other things. Having that structure in place gives them more ability to trust the process of learning and more ability to know what they need to do. And finally, one of my huge goals as an educator is to build community. My background is in student affairs. So before I started teaching, I worked in a variety of different positions within student affairs. And so building those student connections, building that relationship is essential. And especially with teaching courses where I have major group projects, that sense of community and building that community is even more vital. So one of the first things that I do in classes is I provide them with a sign-in sheet. If you're doing this, you want to make sure that you're doing it in a manner that you're not sharing the Excel spreadsheet with anybody but yourself. And so what I do is I set up a sign-in sheet. I just have them enter their first and last name. You could have them enter other information, the course that they're in, the date and time. The reality is anytime you do a Google form and people input information, you get a timestamp. So having them enter the date or select a date is an extra step. You want to make sure that it's required. And so I put a big arrow there. Anything that you want students to answer, you need to make sure that it has a requirement related to it. And then over here on the sharing, this is for the Google form. So the Google Excel version. Anytime you do a form, it will create an Excel document for you. And if you have this shared, then privacy is at risk. So you want to make sure that you're not sharing that part of the form or that aspect of things with any of your students, because you want to ensure that you're following FERPA and not violating their privacy in any way. I found this is much easier than the Zoom meeting reports. If any of you have tried looking at those to figure out attendance, they're a mess, right? They have nicknames, they have so-and-so's iPhone, they're not in alphabetical order. You get a notification every time somebody's entered and exited the room. And so if you're trying to keep track of attendance in any way, this has, at least for me, worked much better than trying to sort through all of the data on the Zoom meeting reports. And if any of you have looked at the Zoom meeting reports, you likely know what I'm talking about. It's kind of just a data dump that you then have to figure out what to do with that information. Another thing that I utilize a lot with the Google Forms aspect are think, pair, share activities. Think, pair, share is often used in a traditional classroom setting where we say, think about this particular thing for a moment, write down your thoughts on it, share it with your peer, and then we share back with the room that information. I've utilized this using Google Forms by putting specific questions on there. Sometimes they have one question, sometimes they have 3 or 4. It gives people more of an opportunity to think about things. We have people in our classes that need to process things a little bit more to be able to provide an answer versus saying, okay, unmute yourself or share this in chat. And you may have people that always dominate that conversation. This, you can see on the form who's entered information in. If you require their names, I don't usually ever require their names. I just look for how many people have entered information. And if I have a class of 60 and about 50 have entered, I go, okay, we're going to wrap things up here in a minute. And then I either have them review the information on their own and we discuss it. I review it really quickly to say, these are the key things that came out through that discussion. Or I send them into a breakout room with a copy of the Excel form that gives them the answers. These are what your peers said in terms of their definitions of leadership. So being able to directly or indirectly lead people by influence, build connections and influence. And then I have them either individually or in a group. For this particular one, I do it in a breakout room. I put them in the breakout room and I say, what are the 2 best definitions that you found in terms of leadership? In the past, in-person classes, I would have them do an activity where they rated them and we came up with the best definitions this way. So this is an alternative version of doing that. And it gives people an opportunity to think about things a little bit more. Like I said, I do this for pretty much any question that I would typically use Think, Pair, Share for in a traditional classroom setting. For the virtual setting, I will utilize something along these lines. I also found that breakout room activities need to be a bit more structured. One of the activities I do in my business communications course is I have them do a quick presentation. It's a 5-minute presentation as though they're executives and they are presenting to the press about some sort of issue that's come up within their company. And so you can see on here, they have directions for what they need to do. They know how long they'll be in their breakout room. And I tell them all of this as well, right? But when they get into that room, a lot of times they've forgotten what they need to do. And so this gives them the steps of, this is what you need to do once you get into that room to come up with what you're doing. So breakout room 1, in this case, they worked with an ice cream company and there was a listeria outbreak in the supply chain. The product had sickened and killed some people. And when they came back, they presented to the class what they would do in that situation. So what would you say if you were leading a press conference related to this particular thing? It gives them clear, concise directions, and they're able to go into their room and get to work and bring something back, right? That's the key part about breakout rooms. If we're sending people into a room to do a discussion, what are we asking them to come back with after they've completed that discussion? And so this is one example of what I did with a particular breakout room. I also use Google Jamboard in a lot of ways within my classes. This particular one, the top one is just sorting managers and leaders skills. So in team dynamics and leadership, we talk about what's a manager versus what's a leader. And I can see when they're moving things around on their board and what's going on in there, and then we can have an overall discussion. So this is kind of a pre-activity. Like before you do the lecture on that particular thing, I have an idea of where they are in terms of their skills. I'm able to gauge what they're currently seeing as manager skills and leader skills. The bottom one is something I haven't necessarily used in class, but I wanted to give you an example of another way that you could use Google Jamboard. And so for this one, what's your definition of teamwork might be what I say to them. And they can create a collage on here of a picture of teamwork, a quote of teamwork, their definition, and utilize the different options over here on the side of Jamboard to do that. So they can add sticky notes, they can add pictures, they can add text. And anytime I use this particular technology, Jamboard, I always explain it to students because even if we've used it in class before, I know it's not something they're necessarily using regularly. So anytime I send them into a breakout room with a new type of technology, I also make sure I explain that technology to them too, just briefly, right? This is what you need to do on here. This is how you work this particular document. Another breakout room activity that I did was an escape room challenge. I did this on Google Forms, and I have a link to how to do this that I will share with you. But I did this for the book Drive by Daniel Pink. We read that in our Team Dynamics and Leadership course. And typically in an in-person class, I had them do a book club discussion. So I would give them a group of questions to work their way through. They got very distracted doing that in person, and I would see them, get off topic with that. So I knew in a breakout room that they needed more structure for that discussion. So they were assigned the task of working through these activities in 45 minutes. When they got to the end of these activities, they would have a presentation that they were doing to the class about their overall viewpoints on the book. So it opened up the discussion in a different manner. And there was fairly good feedback about this particular activity. So as they moved through it, they had puzzles that they had to solve. Motivation definitions, they had a puzzle that went along with that, just in terms of basic terminology for the book. Do you understand the terms? Do you understand the overall concepts? I did have groups that got stuck in this part of the activity because they probably didn't read the book. So in the future, when doing things like this, after 5, 10, 15 minutes, if all of the groups haven't moved forward, I would give the answer to the breakout rooms just to keep them on task with what their main goal is. So that was their first puzzle. And then the second puzzle, they were looking at different behavior types. For both of the puzzles, it gives you information at the end, right? Your answer is going to be 7 capital letters with no spaces. This is what they'll put in the form to move to the next page of the form. If you've ever used Google Forms for anything, it requires an answer or it doesn't to move forward. And you can kind of decide how you set that up in terms of what makes sense for the activity that you're completing. The next question was to get them talking about how they might use this information to improve relationships within their organization. And so for this one, they had to have at least 100 words. Once they had 100 words, it would move them forward to the next point in the Google form. And then at the end, they received a message that they'd been hired to serve as a consultant, and their goal is to change workplaces or educational institutions for future. What will make it a better environment as they move forward? They came back then to the class and we did a quick presentation. As you can see, it's 90 seconds to 2 minutes. You can decide what makes sense in terms of that. For this class, I will probably make the presentation slightly shorter in the future, just because it is a larger class with around 60 students in it. But if I was doing it in a class with 30, it may be a smaller presentation. You kind of have to make that decision based on what's going on in your particular classroom. Some tips and tricks. I'm getting notification to unmute. Have I been muted the whole time? Okay.
No, sorry. I went to let somebody in.
I always look, and I feel like in a room of educators, somebody would have said something by now, but sometimes we talk to ourselves. So, so in terms of some tips and tricks, adjust the privacy settings, make sure that it's accessible for your students. That's often where people struggle with this type of thing. People may not be able to get in. And if they're not logged in through their school account, that could be an issue. So requiring them to sign in that way, or unchecking that particular setting so that they don't have to be signed in through their school account. Always explain new technology to students. Students are just as afraid, if not more afraid, of new technology as faculty members sometimes are. So explain new technology, help them build a better understanding of it. Move them through the process. If it's an extended breakout room time, like the Google form that I showed you where we did an escape room sort of activity, if you notice that people aren't moving forward to the next part of the activity, feel free to give them the answers to that particular thing, right? You've spent enough time on this part of the process, now it's time to move forward to this part. And we often have to manage that as the faculty members because students may get really caught up on that. And for this particular activity, they weren't able to move forward without that additional assistance. Try new things. If the last several months have taught you nothing else, like don't be afraid to try new things. There's always going to be things that don't go as well as you hope they would, right? And then there's going to be things that go really well. And so try out those new things. Don't be afraid to test new technology and new information. And then ask for feedback from your students. Did this activity work? What should be done differently in the future? By opening that conversation fairly early in the term, they're often more willing to share struggles and challenges that they've had along the line. I'm going to open it up now for questions or helping you with any assistance that you may need in terms of figuring out how to use these particular applications in your classroom.
I've got a quick one.
Yeah.
So my main motivation for joining this today is to find a better way to collaborate with the students real time during my class so that they're not just sitting and staring at my screen. And I really struggled finding something because Zoom is not allowing this with any ease, allowing the students to hop in and type a note, or, you know, if I say, okay, I want each of you to give me 3 words that associate with this particular topic. Okay. And then I like in class, I used to use the whiteboard all the time, right? They would all go up, they'd put their stickies on there and we'd be rolling. And I want to try and duplicate that, and I'm having problems with it. So it kind of sounds like you've got a good option for me here in this, what did you call it? It's not, the Jamboard. Is the Jamboard like a whiteboard, a free writing where all of the students can contribute at the same time?
Yes, you can utilize it that way. So let me pull up Jamboard and I'll show you how that works a little bit more. Some of the other things I've used for that are Mentimeter, which is a free resource. You can only use, you can only have 2 slides at a time, but it will provide you with like real-time answers. So you can create like a word cloud from it. You can create.
You said that was Mentoring Meter?
Mentimeter. I'll share the link for you here in a second. So here's the link to Mentimeter. And then let me get Jamboard up. So this is what Jamboard looks like. And over here on the side, and you can have all of your students on the same one at a time. If you do use Jamboard, it is maxed out at 50 people. For many of you, that won't be a concern, but anytime I try to use it in a class where there's 60, I just open 2 separate Jamboards. But everybody could be typing comments on here at the same time. And actually, let me do it this way. I'll share it so you can actually see how it works and test it. So this is what I meant about changing privacy settings. So I'm going to change it so that anyone that has the link can access it, since there are people here that aren't from IUPUI and wouldn't be able to access it. And so if you click on that link, over here on the side, you can click on sticky note and, you know, whatever message that you want to put on. You can also, and all of you are welcome to try this. So people can type things in and they can upload images as well. I don't have any images to upload, but it would give you the ability to also upload images. And so you could have conversation on here. If you wanted different groups to work on it, they can have different frames that they're in, and everybody gets logged in unless they're signed into their account as an anonymous animal. So like we have
Hey, Michelle.
chipmunk.
We only have view access.
Uh-oh. I
Could you
did
show
that
us
on
how to change that?
to show you how to do this, right?
Jill, so just images, or one of the things also that I'm trying to find is uploading the audio or a video, small video. So is this possible with this application? Or just
I
which,
don't believe so. I believe you can only add images. I don't see a place to add a video to this particular application. And so I changed it so anybody could access it, but what I didn't do and why you couldn't look at it is because you have to make it editor and not just viewer anytime you want your students to be able to do anything. So this can be helpful in that particular process. You can send them into a breakout room and you can see what they're doing in terms of this. That's often how I will utilize it. I'm usually the person that's underlining everything and circling everything and drawing all over. So whichever one of you is that person right now, that's often my role. There's also the ability to annotate on Zoom. And so if you click on the annotate button at the top, you can have students write on your PowerPoint, or you could have them use that as well. I've never used it. I'm not a big fan of that. I usually have them do something else, but it is something where you could have them write on that. And to find that, if you look at the Zoom next to share, there's pause share, and then there's an annotate button.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
Can you tell who is contributing what to the Jamboard if it's desired to see who actually participated?
For you to be able to see that, they would need to sign in. And if they're signed in, yes, you should be able to see that. Otherwise, it's going to show them as like anonymous dinosaur or anonymous penguin or anonymous something else.
Thank you.
Michelle, this is super helpful. Thank you so much for the presentation. I was wondering if you could comment a bit on the utilization of these tools with subgroups of a class. You know, are you a fan of kind of using a random group generator, or do you keep the same group together over time? And how is it with choreographing like the group access to any or all of these things?
If I'm doing a group project, I keep them in the same group. But in terms of in-class activities, I do random breakout rooms, and whoever you end up with is who you end up with, which is also how I tend to do breakout rooms in an in-person class. I try to mix it up so that people are with different people all the time so that they don't get stuck on, oh, well, this is how this person thinks. And with Zoom, it's fairly easy because you can click on the breakout room tab, and then if you put the group together and you don't like how it looks, you can just click recreate and it will put people in a new room. And so that's what I utilize for that portion of it. I try to not overthink who I'm putting in breakout rooms unless it's a day that we're focused on team things, and then I put them in their teams. But most of the time, even in classes where it's very focused on a group project, I switch them from place to place.
Thank you.
I will share a link on, this is a link on how to build an escape room activity using a Google form. And then somebody asked about the form I used for the book club, and it's not going to be super beneficial, but I will show you kind of what it looks like on the first page. So I'll share that part. you'll only be able to see the first page here without opening it and having access to other things. And there's the PowerPoint again for that information. I know that I've missed several questions, so I'm going to go through and scroll through and see if there's anything to answer.
Ask them
here.
for you, Michelle, if that's easier.
Oh, perfect.
How about sharing separate Google Docs with different groups in different breakout rooms? Do you share individually in each room once the students are already in there, or are there other options?
I usually share the links with them before I put them in breakout rooms. And the reason I do that is because if we have an issue like I just had on Jamboard where I didn't make it so all of that you could access it, I want to know that before they get in there so that they're not sitting in there going, well, we can't open it, so we're just going to wait until she brings us back to the main room. So I always share those ahead of time, and they know at this point, all right, you're going to click on this link. When you get into your breakout session, you're going to look at this link more in depth. You can also certainly give different rooms different activities and give them editor access. And then you can see if they're typing on a document in real time. I haven't done that because that's a lot of extra creation of document and a lot of keeping those documents straight in terms of like which room has which document. If I did a class that was like an English class where we were looking at poetry and we were annotating poetry, I might use that in a different capacity.
That was the only other question in the chat. So if there are other questions, feel free to unmute or use the chat.
Hey, Michelle, it's Maureen Keller. I had the question about the different, sharing the different docs and things like that. I would say in about half of my class sessions, I use a Google form like you used. And then other times, in order to just facilitate more group work, as you know that we do in IVYT classes, I had each group have their own Google Doc, which is exactly what you're saying. Like, it's a lot to manage. I tended to I keep folders of them in my Google file, and I would number them like 1, 2, 3, 4, because I usually don't have more than 4 groups. And then I would share them out. But I was worried about, I was trying to see if there was a creative way to share, group number 1's Google Doc with group number 1 without having to depend on me to do it in each of their breakout rooms, because it takes me a while to go into each breakout room and give each group their Google Doc. Does that make sense?
That does make sense.
I know. I'm actually kind of glad that you're stumped though, because I thought there's got to be an easier.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. If anybody else like has a great practice for that, certainly share it. I mean, is there, I know the material that you're covering, is there any reason that they couldn't have, like they couldn't all see the links for other people?
No, I think that would be fine. Honestly, my concern was like them being like, wait, what group was I in? You know what I mean? Because if I share it in the chat before they go into their breakout rooms, like they don't necessarily, I guess they're numbered. The breakout rooms are numbered, right?
The breakout rooms are numbered, but they wouldn't know their number until they got in there. So I don't know a good way to do that.
You can set breakout rooms with group names. So for example, you can, before the meeting, you can set up breakout rooms with group names and add students to those groups. So prior to the meeting, they'd know which groups they were in.
Right. Yeah, thank you for that reminder.
Yeah, you can always set up the rooms in advance, but I haven't had much luck with setting up the rooms in advance because
yeah, I haven't either.
Sometimes people don't show up then the day that, and then you have to shift everybody around. So,
and just Michelle, do you find in the Google Doc?
I didn't hear your question. You cut out.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Do you find that you use forms more than docs then?
I use forms probably. I use docs if I send them into the room with like a specific activity. I will use Google Docs for that. Sometimes within that, I will have them fill out a form. So once you've come up with an answer to this question, enter it in this form so that I know that they're done working through that as a group.
That's a good idea.
But
Okay, that could be. Okay.
I use forms more for like think, pair, share sorts of things, which I do all the time. So
Okay.
I would say use both of them at least once during a class period. So.
Right. Okay, thank you for that.
Any other questions?
I have one more, and just whether you
Okay.
have advice if students are not able to engage in a class except through their phone or a small tablet. These tools are so much easier to use, especially if you have multiple screens, but I'm mindful that some students just don't have access to those resources.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And that's certainly one of the things that can be an issue, is that the ability to access the different things. For both of the classes I teach at IUPUI, they're doing presentations and other things along those lines. So a computer is necessary. For some other courses, it's not going to be feasible for them to have that. Shortening the URL, I have found helps. So doing the shorter URL through Google. That way, if they are typing something in, they have all that information. And then also you could provide the information prior to class and say, these are the documents that we're going to go through. That's one of my goals this semester, is to have that information available at ahead of time so that people are able to look at it. But it can be challenging for sure if somebody is only utilizing a phone for class. And I know right now I think everybody in the state is currently virtual for the first few weeks. I'm not positive on that does create additional issues. As we move into students that are taking courses in a virtual situation that signed up for fully virtual, we may find some of those differences to not be as prevalent because they were expecting to be virtual versus expecting to be in person. So yeah, I agree 100%, Kathy, that we have to be aware of the impact this can have on students that aren't able to access that technology. And usually I have a form that I ask them to fill out ahead of the class, just giving me a little bit of information about who they are and what some of the challenges and struggles they think they'll have related to virtual education in general, as well as, what I can do as a teacher to make it the best possible environment for them. Any other questions?
Michelle, that form that form that you just mentioned, would you be willing to share that?
Yes, I can share that for sure. It's set for my particular classes, so I'll make some adjustments so it's a little bit more generic. And I'm not sure which of my Google folders it's in right now, so Rachel, is it possible to send out information to people that signed up?
Yeah, I will send, Michelle has shared her slides and lots of great links. I'll send those out to everybody who registered if you weren't able to grab them from the chat. I was wondering, Michelle, if you could share some more of the feedback that your students have given on their experiences, maybe some of the things that they really appreciated, some of the things that they said, please don't do this again. If you have any, you said you ask your students feedback all the time. So
I do ask them for feedback all the time. So I received really good feedback in terms of both the breakout room activity where they did presentations. They don't ever like that activity in class or virtually, right? They don't want to give those particular presentations. but that the directions for doing that were clear and concise, and they knew what was expected of them when they came back. For the escape room, they had a really good time with it. They hadn't done anything like that, and this was probably, it was week 8 of the fall semester. So by week 8 of the fall semester, like they were all a little, all of us were a little zoomed out, like a little fatigued in terms of how things were working. And so they liked that because it was a different way of learning the information and engaging with the information. And they thought it was fun. With attendance sheets, they ask for them, so I don't have to ever give them, like, remember that I need to give them to them. They're like, oh, like I didn't get the attendance link today, right? It's similar to I didn't get the sign-in sheet today, right? They've kind of come to that expectation. And so being clear in your expectations at the start of the term and helped them to better understand what they needed to do moving forward in the term, just like with anything else, right? That clear understanding of this is what we're doing and this is what is necessary in order to build success. Kind of helps with that process.
I have a
got-
small, sorry, that's okay. I have a question that you said that you used that sign-in sheet for attendance, right?
Yes.
So is it the students go and write their names in that sheet?
Yes, so let me share what I do. So this is a sample. I label them with the name of my class, and I just have them type their first and last name. I make it short answer and I make it required. And then you can see the responses on this list, or it will create a Google Sheet if you click on this plus, and then it will show everybody's name within that column. So you can see that at 1:20 on 1/22 at 10:31 a.m. I entered attendance. And so that gives you, if somebody tries to go in, 3 days later and enter their attendance, it's also obvious that it wasn't at that time. And this is what I mentioned with the sharing. You want to make sure that it's set to be private. This one's not, because I wanted you to be able to access it when I was talking about it. But if it's your student attendance, you need to be the only one that can see this link. Like you need to make sure nobody else can see that, because then it's all the student data that you don't want to be sharing with other people. But that creates a whole other sort of privacy FERPA issue that you don't want to be responsible for. So
is there a way to prohibit students from entering another student's name? Or if they have Google accounts, which not all the schools do, but if they have a school Google account, to prohibit it so that they can only enter their names once?
yes, so you can make it, when you're setting up the form up here in settings, I have this restricted to IU so that only students within my class can sign up, or they have to sign up. You can collect email addresses. You can limit it to one response. I don't have it limited because I use the same sign-in sheet for the entire semester. And when you collect email addresses, it does create an additional challenge for students that are trying to sign into it. I don't know if any of you have had this problem, but sometimes my personal email account wants to sign into my school email account. Like when there's Gmail and Google Forms being used, it can create some additional issues in that sense. So you can, though, require more restrictions. You can set up more restrictions on here. You can also make it so that they get receipts of their attendance. So really it's up to you, like how many restrictions you want to add to this. In general, I tend to add less just to make it easier for access.
Michelle, I know that Zoom does not record breakout rooms. So
Correct.
for those students that aren't able to attend real time, and I'm offering an opportunity for them to watch the video after class, what are your best practices on sharing different forms, maybe materials that are talked about or discussed within groups? What's the best way to get these students a reasonable facsimile of the activities for that class?
You can share the links with them just like you would share the links in anything else. So in the fall, when I would share my recording, I would also share links for anything that was Google related for the day. So they'd get the Kaltura recording of the Zoom meeting, and they would get, like, these are the links to the particular activities that we did that day.
Would you allow them an opportunity to do the activities and submit, or is that just cause too much issue? You just basically do it for a review only?
It depends. So it depends on, and it's hard to answer that question right now because the regulations and expectations are so different from place to place in terms of what's being done related to COVID-19 and accommodations. So when in the fall, when participation points weren't, you needed like alternative options for participation points, I would post the video, allow them to write a summary about the video, allow them to do the activities. Right now, if they're not in class and they don't have a reasonable reason to not be there and haven't cleared that with me in advance, then I'm not necessarily sharing all of that with them unless they ask, right? So it's kind of like in a regular class, if they miss like an in-person class and they don't follow up, like how many resources do you provide versus how many do you not provide? And so I tend to err on the side of giving students more information because that's like who I am as an educator. But I know that some people, it's going to be very much like, oh, well, like you weren't there, like, even if you ask me for it, I'm not going to give it to you, right? And so it kind of depends where you fall on that spectrum. I would assume if you're here trying to figure out how to make your classes better and more inclusive and more engaging and all of that stuff, that you're probably going to share those links. But it will share in the same way that it shares within your class period. So that's the nice thing about those forums, is that they're always there. It may have different information on it, right? People may have added information, but then they can also see what they missed in those breakout room discussions.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions?
So this is just a curiosity question, but Michelle, I'm curious how long it took you to learn all this stuff. Is this all self-taught knowledge? Do you enjoy technology and so you were just, you know, sort of engaged in play with it, or did you actually learn in a formal way?
That's a great question. I don't know that I know the answer to that question, but I've always been super passionate about technology. So, and I'm a lifelong learner. Like if I don't know how to do something, I'm going to figure out how to do it. So several years ago, not realizing how much I would need this knowledge now, I did a graduate certificate in learning management systems. And so that helped me have a better understanding of instructional design. It was important for me as an educator to like know how to do that. And so once the nice thing about Google applications is they're fairly intuitive, right? Like Google has done as well as it has because it's pretty easy for us to figure out. And so Once I realized how much easier my life was when I used Google Forms for a bunch of things, in terms of, with teams, if I have an issue in a team and somebody complains to me via email or whatever way about that, like I track it in there. So at the end of the semester, when people say, Michelle, what happened in this team? I know, right? Like I have that information. And so some of it took some practice. The escape room, I wasn't sure like how that was going to work for sure, for certain, but after I did it once, it became much easier to like figure it out the next time. And so the forms take, I forgot this morning that I hadn't done a form for my Monday class for attendance because they meet once a week and I didn't have them last week. And so at 8:58 this morning, like I went in and made that form, right? And so some of them, forms specifically, are very easy to use. Docs is very similar to Word. You just have to, the sharing is just different, right? That's the key with Google applications. The sharing aspect of it is different. But if anybody has questions or wants to figure out how to do some of this stuff more in depth, I will put my email address in here. I'm more than willing to meet with you and talk to you about ways to utilize these things in your classroom.
Great. If there are no other questions, you can unmute and clap, or you could use your reactions or you give your thumbs up, but let's show our appreciation for Michelle and this fantastic presentation. I know I took away some things and I hope you all did as well. As I said, I will be sending out the information that Michelle shared with us today, and you can also, I believe, view the recording on the LEAP Indiana website as soon as that's up. So thank you.
Thanks, everyone.